All right, so welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be diving into Peter Frederick Strawson. He was a philosopher in the latter half of the 20th century, and his influence it's still felt today. So we're talking a thinker who really engaged with a lot of the major areas of philosophy. I mean, everything from like the nitty-gritty of logic and language to like the big questions of metaphysics and epistemology.
And I think what's really interesting about Strawson right off the bat is his main goal. Like, what was he really trying to do? And I think you can say he was trying to grasp these fundamental concepts, the concepts that sort of like structure the way that we think about the world every day. So I'm talking things like objects, ourselves as persons, space, time, causation, like all the basic building blocks. He was really interested in those.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think sometimes with these big thinkers, it's easy to get lost in the weeds and forget like what was the driving force behind it all. And it wasn't just identifying these concepts, right? I mean, he had a kind of a two-pronged goal. First, he wanted to show that all those skeptical challenges, those challenges to these basic ideas that have been around for centuries, that they're actually groundless. And then second, he argued that our understanding of these concepts, that it doesn't need to be like reduced down to sensory experiences like some of the earlier empiricists thought, or explained away by like fundamental science. He thought these were fundamental in a way that couldn't be reduced. Yeah.
Exactly. And this is really key for understanding Strawson. Metaphysics for him.
Yeah.
It wasn't about some like super elaborate system,
Yeah.
built up from scratch. It was more like a descriptive task. He wanted to lay out these essential notions,
Yeah.
like carefully, and really dig into how they're all connected within like the big picture of our conceptual scheme. And this was a big move, especially in Oxford philosophy at the time. It helped shift the focus back to those traditional philosophical questions after they've been kind of pushed aside during that period of anti-metaphysics.
Yeah, it's like he was pushing back against that trend and saying, no, these questions are still important. And it wasn't just an Oxford thing either. Like his work, it had this ripple effect. And pretty soon you had philosophers all over engaging with his ideas. I'm talking like big names: Russell, Sellers, Putnam, Quine, Davidson, Kripke. All these major figures were grappling with Strawson's work.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think that speaks to his influence,
Yeah.
like to have that kind of reach across different philosophical camps. It's pretty remarkable. But to give you a bit more context, I mean, Strawson's early life, it definitely played a role in shaping his thinking. He studied PPE at Oxford. He was actually taught by Grice, H.P. Grice, the guy behind the Maxims of Conversation.
Oh, no, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and then like a lot of his generation, people like Ayer, Hampshire, Hare, Hart, Bolheim. He served in World War II. And after the war, he held a few academic positions, first at Bangor and then at University College, Oxford.
So it sounds like he was already pretty embedded in the philosophical world by the time he started publishing his own work.
Oh, yeah, he was definitely in the thick of it. But there's this one moment that really kind of launched him onto the international stage. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think so. Are you talking about the publication of On Referring?
Exactly. It was in 1950, published in Mind. And it wasn't just the article itself. It was the debate that followed
With Austin.
about the nature of truth. That really got people talking. It was a big philosophical event.
Yeah, that debate is still studied and discussed today. It's one of those moments in philosophical history that really kind of captured the imagination. And it's interesting to think about the different ways that these two philosophers worked. Austin, his influence came a lot through his lectures and his talks, but Strawson was really committed to writing, to getting his ideas down in books and articles.
The good point. It's like two different approaches to disseminating ideas. And they both had a huge impact. Eventually, Strawson succeeded Ryle. Gilbert Ryle is the Waynflete Professor of Metaphysical Philosophy at Magdalen. So we're talking a pretty prestigious position.
Yeah, and he received a lot of recognition for his work over the years. Elected to the British Academy in 1960, knighted in 77, and then in 98 he was included in that really prestigious Library of Living Philosophers series, which is, quite an honor. And I think it's fair to say that from like the mid-20th century to the late 80s, he was probably the most talked about British philosopher in academia. Like he was a major figure.
Oh, absolutely. A giant in the field.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember, the person behind the philosophy too. He was married, had 4 children, really enjoyed culture, literature, poetry especially. He could apparently recite long passages from memory.
Wow.
Yeah. So he's clearly a very well-rounded individual.
Right up until his death in 2006, he was active in philosophy, just constantly pushing us to rethink our assumptions. So let's dive into some of those key ideas. And I think a good place to start is with that groundbreaking article on referring.
Okay, yeah, on referring. So the title itself is a direct response to Russell's on denoting. And Russell's theory was kind of the dominant view at the time, so Strawson was really taking on the establishment.
And just to remind folks, Russell's theory of descriptions, it was all about explaining how these definite descriptions, phrases like the current king of France, how they actually function in our language.
Right. And Strawson's issue wasn't that he thought Russell was completely wrong. He just didn't think Russell's unified account could capture like the full range of ways that we use "the" in these descriptions. It's like he was pointing out the gaps in Russell's theory, the places where it just didn't quite hold up.
And one of the main points of contention was how Russell analyzed a sentence like, the king of France is bald, right?
Yeah, exactly. So Russell, he claimed that that sentence actually means something like, there exists one and only one king of France, and that individual is bald. But for Strawson, the problem was that Russell's analysis implied that the sentence has to be false if there's no king of France.
Because the first part of Russell's analysis, there exists one and only one king of France. That would be untrue if there was no king of France.
Right, but Strawson said, well, in that kind of situation, we wouldn't typically say that's false. We'd be more likely to say something like, hold on, there is no king of France. So he's suggesting that when the reference fails, the statement, it's not really true or false. It kind of falls into this truth-value gap, as it came to be called. So the big takeaway here is that language in use isn't always neatly divided into true and false statements.
Right. There's this gray area that Russell's theory didn't seem to account for. So for Strawson, was the primary function of a definite description, was it always to refer to something specific?
Not necessarily to assert that something exists uniquely. No. His main point was that we often use definite descriptions like the X to actually refer to or pick out a particular object without necessarily saying that there is such an X. Like,
Right.
imagine you're standing next to your car and you say to someone, the tire is flat. You're not telling them that you own a car. You're using the tire to identify a specific part of a specific object.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's more about like pointing something out, like using language to direct someone's attention.
Exactly. It's about identifying reference,
Yeah.
not making this existence claim, as Strawson himself put it. And he argued that the existence and uniqueness of something fitting the description, that's often presupposed, not asserted when we use these definite descriptions. And this concept of presupposition became a really influential idea, not just in philosophy, but in linguistics too.
So it's like we're relying on all these shared background assumptions when we communicate.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot going on beneath the surface.
So after kind of shaking things up with reference, Strawson then turned his attention to another big philosophical topic, truth. And he did this by engaging in this pretty famous debate with Austin.
Yeah, this was the big one. Austin was a very dominant figure in Oxford at the time. So
Yeah.
Strawson's critique, it could be seen as a real challenge to his intellectual leadership, philosophically. The debate centered around Austin's attempt to revive a version of the correspondence theory of truth.
And Austin's version, it relied on this idea of linguistic conventions, right? Referential conventions and descriptive conventions.
Yeah, that's right. In a nutshell, Austin was arguing that a statement is true when the state of affairs picked out by the referential conventions of the sentence in a given context,
Right.
when that matches the conditions specified by the descriptive conventions of the rest of the sentence.
Okay, so can you give me an example, like a concrete example to make that a little clearer?
Sure, let's go back to the television is broken. So for Austin, the referential conventions of that sentence, spoken in a particular room, would pick out a specific TV, like the one in that room. The descriptive conventions, the is broken part, that would specify a particular state that the TV could be in. So the statement is true if the actual state of that specific TV aligns with that description.
Okay, so I'm following so far. What was Strawson's problem with this?
Strawson's main criticism was that Austin's account of what these referential conventions actually link sentences with. It was just too vague. Like, does the television refer to the physical object itself? If so, that's not really a state of affairs or a fact. He also argued that facts and states of affairs aren't really the kinds of things in the world that we can refer to directly. He said that words like fact, they're more like tools we use to express claims, like saying it is a fact that P, that's just another way of asserting P without actually pointing to some new entity.
So Strawson was kind of questioning the whole foundation of Austin's theory.
Yeah, exactly. And he also pointed out that Austin's theory seemed to have some limitations in its scope, like how would it apply to a statement like, there are no unicorns? What are the referential targets in that case? And a lot of philosophers found Strawson's criticisms pretty persuasive.
So what about Strawson's own view of truth? Did he offer an alternative?
He did lean towards a perspective that was rooted in an idea from F.P. Ramsey, which is that saying P is true is basically the same as just saying P. But Strawson's main contribution was to emphasize the specific linguistic acts that the word true allows us to perform. So even if the core meaning is that equivalence, the word true, it's not redundant. It serves a purpose in our language.
It's like it's doing some work, even if it's not pointing to some grand correspondence with reality.
Right, exactly. It's more about its role in our linguistic practices.
So moving on from language and truth, Strawson also made some pretty significant contributions to logical theory. And his 1952 book, Introduction to Logical Theory, that's considered a pretty important work.
Yeah, absolutely. Even Quine, he reviewed it in mind. So that gives you an idea of how it was received in the field. And Strawson's goal in that book was to clarify the nature, the scope, and the inherent limitations of formal logic. So he was focused on explaining key concepts like entailment, which he explained in terms of self-contradiction. And he delved into things like logical form and proof systems, applying his insights to both traditional and modern logic.
So did the book have a lasting impact on the field?
Well, the main body of the book, it might not have been hugely influential, but there were three specific things that really resonated with philosophers. First, he gave a more detailed account of presupposition, building on his earlier work on reference. Second, he explored the relationship between the logical connectives we use in everyday language, like and or if, then, and the truth-functional connectives that are used in formal logic. And he argued that there are some big differences there, that ordinary language doesn't really follow a precise formal logic in the same way.
Which makes sense. I mean, ordinary language is much more flexible and context dependent.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And this issue of the relationship between formal logic and everyday language, it's still a central topic in the philosophy of language today.
And what was the third influential element?
He proposed a really interesting approach to the problem of induction, which is something we'll talk about more when we get to his work on epistemology. But it shows just how wide-ranging his interests were.
So then in 1959, he published what many consider to be his magnum opus, Individuals, with the subtitle, An Essay in Descriptive Metaphysics. That title alone sounds really ambitious.
It was a big project. And Strawson actually coined the term descriptive metaphysics to describe what he was doing, to contrast it with what he called revisionary metaphysics. So by metaphysics, he meant the abstract and general nature of his inquiry. And by descriptive, he meant that he wasn't trying to change how we think. He wanted to articulate the shared conceptual framework that we all use to think about the world. He believed that there's this fundamental core to human thinking, with these basic categories and concepts that don't really change much over time.
So it's like he was mapping out the essential structure of our thought.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And in Individuals, he was particularly focused on our ability to refer to and think about the things that populate our world, including ourselves.
Exactly. And the book is often seen as this deeper exploration of his earlier ideas about reference. So the first part looks at how we refer to objects in the world, and then the second part delves into the distinction between subject expressions and predicate expressions, linking that grammatical distinction to the fundamental kinds of things we refer to.
And the first few chapters of Individuals, those had a pretty immediate impact on philosophers, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. So chapter 1, he tackles this really fundamental question. Is there a primary category of entities that we can think about without having to think about other categories first? And he argues that our ability to refer linguistically depends on what he called identifying reference. And we do this in a couple of ways. One way is by picking out something we're currently perceiving, like this microphone. Okay. And the other way is through descriptions. And Strawson argued that ultimately those descriptions have to connect back to our present environment through these spatiotemporal relations.
So like our ability to think about, say, a historical figure like Cleopatra, that ultimately depends on our understanding of a spatio-temporal framework that's grounded in our present experience.
Precisely. And because we're always updating this framework as we move through time and space, we have to be able to re-identify objects and places. And from this, he drew an epistemological conclusion. He said it's basically incoherent to be skeptical about the very procedures we use for these identifications. while also operating within the spatiotemporal framework itself. It's like you can't have it both ways.
Right. You can't use the framework to doubt the framework.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And he went on to argue that material bodies, in a broad sense, those are the most basic entities within our conceptual scheme, the things we can refer to most directly.
And then in chapter 2, he gets into this really interesting thought experiment. What if we had a conceptual scheme where material bodies weren't basic? Like a scheme built on a completely different kind of sensory input, like just auditory experience.
Yeah, it's this really creative exploration. Could a creature that only has auditory experiences, could they grasp the idea of an object without relying on spatial concepts? And he explores this idea of relating individual sounds to a continuous master sound, kind of like an analogy to space. And he seemed to think that maybe it's theoretically possible, but his point was that even in these alternative conceptual schemes, there would have to be something that plays the same role as our concept of space.
So it's like there's this structural feature that's necessary for any kind of objective experience.
Right. And this chapter has been super influential. It's generated a lot of discussion among philosophers.
And then you have the chapter on persons, which is probably one of his most famous contributions.
Yeah, persons is a big one. And in that chapter, Strawson compares different ways of thinking about ourselves. He critiques what he calls the no ownership view, which denies that we really refer to ourselves as the owners of our experiences. And he argues that even that view implicitly relies on self-reference to explain the illusion of ownership. He also challenges that Cartesian picture, the idea that the self is this purely mental substance that's totally separate from the body. He says that that separation just doesn't make sense of our ability to ascribe experiences to both ourselves and others.
So he's arguing that when we use the pronoun I, we're not referring to just a mind or just a body, but to this unified entity that has both physical and mental aspects.
Exactly. It's this primitive concept, not reducible to either one. And he also argues that because we can ascribe mental states to ourselves, we must be able to ascribe them to others too. And the way we do that has to be logically adequate. And this, he claimed, kind of dissolves the traditional problem of other minds.
So our understanding of ourselves and others as these unified beings, that's a fundamental part of how we think.
Yeah, that's a key part of Strawson's view.
Okay, so after individual, Strawson turned his attention to another philosophical giant, Immanuel Kant. And he wrote this book called The Bounds of Sense, with the subtitle, An Essay on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason.
Yeah, The Bounds of Sense. And Strawson was clearly fascinated by Kant. He saw a lot of depth and power in the critique, but he wasn't totally on board with Kant's own way of framing his project. Like, Kant was really interested in explaining the possibility of synthetic a priori judgments.
And Strawson, he kind of approached the critique from a different angle, as the title suggests,
Okay.
focusing on the bounds of sense. And there's this play on words there, right?
Right, so sense can mean a couple of different things. And for Strawson, what Kant was really doing was exploring the limits of what's intelligible, what makes sense within our experience. So
Right.
he argued that Kant identified this minimal structure that's needed for any coherent conception of experience. The idea that experience has to be of objects that are independent, spatial, and temporal, and governed by principles like permanence and causation. But Strawson also saw Kant as setting this upper limit. He said that if we try to extend our concepts beyond the realm of possible experience, we just end up with meaningless claims.
So it's like Kant was mapping out the boundaries of what we can understand.
Exactly. And Strawson's project in The Bounds of Sense was to sort of extract those insights about the limits of our understanding from what he saw as the less coherent aspects of Kant's transcendental idealism.
So he wanted to take the good stuff and leave the rest behind.
Right. And he did this by really carefully examining Kant's arguments, including the transcendental deduction. And Strawson argued that for our diverse experiences to kind of come together in a single consciousness, they have to be connected as this temporally extended experience of a unified objective world.
So this idea that self-consciousness is somehow linked to the perception of objects, that's a crucial part of Strawson's interpretation of Kant.
Yeah, it is. And he kind of reconstructed Kant's argument by suggesting that the very idea of experience requires that we apply these fundamental categories to things that aren't themselves experiences, and that implies a connection to independent objects.
And that interpretation has been really influential in analytic philosophy, although I know there's still debate among Kant scholars about whether it's the right way to read Kant.
Right, there's always debate.
Yeah.
But Strawson definitely shaped the conversation, and he also engaged with Kant's arguments in the dialectic, particularly the paralogisms. And he saw those as offering valuable insights into the problems with Cartesian dualism.
So he thought Kant was right to reject dualism, but maybe didn't go far enough because he was still committed to transcendental idealism.
Right. And Strawson wanted to develop a more tenable account by getting rid of that idealism.
Yeah.
And he also critically examined Kant's arguments for idealism, including his views on space and time, and his arguments against transcendental realism.
So the bounds of sense, it had a huge impact on Kant's scholarship. And it also brought this renewed attention to transcendental arguments as a philosophical strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. Strawson's work really highlighted how Kant seemed to be uncovering these necessary connections within our ways of thinking about the world. And if you can demonstrate these dependencies, it could have some pretty powerful implications for dealing with skepticism. Like if you can show that the skeptic's own claims actually presuppose the things they're doubting, then you've kind of undermined their position. And while Strawson himself later developed a different way of responding to skepticism, the idea of transcendental arguments as a response to skepticism, that's generated a ton of philosophical work.
So after his deep dive into Kant, Strawson kept on writing. And he published a number of other books, like Subject and Predicate in Logic and Grammar, Skepticism and Naturalism, Analysis and Metaphysics. And these books tackled a whole range of philosophical issues.
Yeah, he was really prolific. And Subject and Predicate, that was a particularly ambitious work. He kind of revisited that fundamental distinction between subject and predicate, and he offered a more refined perspective. He also engaged with these new theories of reference for proper names, like the ones being proposed by Kripke. And his goal was to show the complexity of predicates in ordinary language, how they involve universals, exemplification, temporal dimensions. And he offered this new framework for understanding the relationship between grammatical structure and the functional roles of language.
And then in Skepticism and Naturalism, he took on skepticism head-on, in all its different forms, from the classic skepticism about the external world to these more modern scientific and materialist denials of things like color and consciousness.
Right, and in that book, Strawson argued against skepticism by emphasizing the fundamental presuppositions of thought and inquiry, and the fact that we can't really escape our ordinary human perspective. He said that these philosophical skeptical doubts, they're not really genuine doubts, like no one actually lives their life as if they were true.
So it's like a kind of a detached intellectual exercise.
Exactly. And this actually marked a bit of a shift in Strawson's own view of skepticism. He moved away from that transcendental argument framework, and he advocated for this kind of relaxed realism, where we accept the validity of our ordinary ways of thinking,
Yeah.
without feeling the need to reduce them to some more fundamental scientific level.
And then in Analysis and Metaphysics, he explored different conceptions of philosophy itself, and he defended his own view of philosophical analysis as this process of revealing the conceptual connections in our thinking without necessarily trying to reduce everything to some kind of foundational level.
Right. He distinguished between reductive and connective analysis. And he argued for this relaxed analysis that aims to clarify our concepts by showing how they're related, rather than trying to break them down into simpler parts. So that book really reflects his mature thinking about the nature and the value of philosophy.
And we can't talk about Strawson without mentioning this really influential paper he wrote called Freedom and Resentment. And it's interesting because he claimed that he wasn't as intellectually drawn to moral philosophy as he was to other areas. But this paper has become one of his most famous and widely discussed contributions.
Yeah, it's a classic. And in Freedom and Resentment, Strawson was trying to address this tension between determinism and our everyday practices of holding each other morally responsible. And he did this by distinguishing between two perspectives we can take towards other people: the participant perspective and the objective perspective. So from the objective standpoint, we see people as causally determined parts of the natural world. But from the participant standpoint, we see them as appropriate targets of these reactive attitudes like gratitude, anger, resentment. And those attitudes kind of assume a degree of freedom and responsibility.
And his argument was that these reactive attitudes, they're just too fundamental to human experience to give up.
Yeah, he said that even if determinism were true, it wouldn't force us to abandon the participant standpoint, because these reactive attitudes are so deeply ingrained in what it means to be human and to have relationships with other people. And he explored the conditions under which we do suspend that participant perspective, like when someone have a legitimate excuse or when we're dealing with people who have permanent incapacities. And this paper has sparked a huge amount of discussion on free will, moral responsibility, and the nature of these reactive attitudes.
So it's like he offered a way to reconcile our ordinary moral practices with the deterministic view of the world.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So to sum it all up, Strawson's philosophical journey was really about understanding these basic concepts that shape how we think about the world, from reference and truth to metaphysics, epistemology, and even morality.
Yeah, he covered a lot of ground. And some of his key contributions include his critique of Russell on definite descriptions, his debate with Austin on truth, his work on logical theory and presupposition, the whole project of descriptive metaphysics that he laid out in Individuals, his interpretation of Kant and the bounds of sense, his later work on subject and predicate skepticism and philosophical analysis, and of course, freedom and resentment.
And his work is still relevant today. Like philosophers are still actively debating his ideas.
Which leads to a final thought for you. Given Strawson's emphasis on the importance of our ordinary concepts, how might his work inform how we approach these contemporary debates that are challenging those very concepts,
Huh.
especially in light of all the scientific advancements and new technologies that are emerging? I think that's something worth thinking about as we continue to try to understand ourselves and the world.
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I think Strawson's work can really help us grapple with. So thanks for joining me for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.